Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I think both myself and all our members regularly check the Eddy website for the latest news and updates, so it really is a pleasure to be here today. And I'm going to speak on can the UK lead the green economy? I'm first going to give a brief introduction to the Aldersgate Group and an overview of green policy before outlining some of the real opportunities for the UK. And talk a bit about what a green strategy would look like before just going through some of the inconsistent messages we've had recently from government, and then also talk a bit about an Aldersgate Group growth statement that we're launching tonight. So firstly, the Aldersgate Group, we are an alliance of leaders from business, politics and society that drive action for a sustainable economy. Our members have a global turnover of more than £270 billion and have some of the largest UK companies, including Microsoft, PepsiCo, M&S, Cooperative and many more. And in terms of environmental policy, I think the starting point really is we do have some very challenging targets. These include for 2020 a 34% reduction in carbon emissions, to generate 15% of our energy from renewable sources, retrofit a quarter of all UK homes, put a smart meter in every single UK household, and some also challenging targets for low emission cars. And this is all in the context of a much larger framework that we all know about, the Climate Change Act, and an 80% reduction by 2050. The most recent analysis shows that we're going to miss our carbon budgets. We're probably going to be okay on the first two carbon budgets. They go up to 2017. But beyond that to 2022, we're going to miss that carbon budget by quite a wide margin on existing policy. So we need new policies, and this is been confirmed recently by the analysis by the Committee on Climate Change, which showed that the recession did lead to a huge drop in carbon emissions. And while we're on track again to meet those 2020 targets, we need new policies beyond 2020. But what they also said is that we shouldn't just bank those reductions from the recession. We should try and increase our targets and increase our performance. And the cost of this of all these reductions is estimated at 1% of GDP by 2025. However, this is not just a cost, it's really an investment. So a recent report by the UN shows that a green investment scenario actually produces more GDP up to 2050 than the business as usual path. And it also leads to greater employment, particularly in energy efficiency and renewable energy power, and the big loser would be coal production. So on these opportunities, where is the UK at the moment? Well, we're doing pretty well. The sector for environmental goods and services is worth over £100 billion, employs more than 900,000 people, and produces over £10 billion a year in exports. It's very encouraging to hear about a green industrial revolution, but every single environmental minister has talked about this since the 1980s. So it is nothing new, but the opportunities are certainly getting greater. And the projections for 2015 are potentially 400,000 new jobs in the UK. But if you look at who's winning the cleantech race, and there was $200 billion worth of investment in 2010, it's not the UK. China's way out front, followed by Germany and the United States, and the UK actually dropped out of the top 10 in last year, which was put down by the UN to policy uncertainty. And our record on renewable energy is not much better. So we are 25th in Europe, ahead of Luxembourg and Malta. So how can the UK win the green economy race? Well, the Aldersgate Group have put forward what a green growth strategy might look like. And I think kind of one of the most important messages from our membership was that this is not just about a flourishing environmental goods and services sector, however important that is. This is about the whole economy, greening the whole economy, and that's why we need policy aimed at the whole economy. But we also will need intervention in dynamic sectors. And particularly some of the interesting opportunities are not just in offshore wind and wind and tidal, but actually in our automotive sector, aerospace, low carbon construction, and IT. But we also have to address the really big market failures, and there's four I'm going to talk about today: finance, taxes, skills, and public procurement. But there really are many more. So first, in terms of finance, I think it's important to put this in context, because what really matters is, again, this overall policy framework. And we need as much policy certainty as possible. This requires both credibility, consistency, and bankability. So quite a good example is zero carbon homes, because the government, or the previous government, did set a very ambitious target for zero carbon homes for 2016. It didn't quite know how it would get the full way, but it had that vision, and then it also had a very consistent tightening of building regulations to get there. So this led to innovation, this was bankable, this was investable, although there has been possibly a few hiccups on the way. I think going back to the previous comments today on the feed-in tariffs for solar, that certainly does not conform to those three principles. It hasn't been consistent, and there's been kind of huge changes in the policy. So I think while there's obviously a pot of money there, and the levels were probably set in the wrong place in the first place, what's really disrupted the investment is those big changes. And for example, a consultation period where the changes happen before the consultation ends. And things like that are just not, do not stimulate investment, and actually could stifle investment in other areas, because investors don't see the UK as possibly the most credible place for long-term policy certainty. So back to finance, and the Aldersgate Group have been a long proponent of the Green Investment Bank. This is to both reduce risk and mobilise finance at scale from institutional investors. There's three really key areas here. The first one is capitalisation. The government's put in £3 billion to the Green Investment Bank, which is maybe slightly less than the Aldersgate Group have recommended, but it is a huge commitment in the current fiscal climate, so we have welcomed that. But I think it's slightly constrained by the borrowing. So the bank won't be able to borrow until 2015. So it won't be able to really ramp up and borrow from the capital markets at scale. In terms of legislation, we'd like to see legislation next year to really kind of, again, provide that certainty for investors. In terms of taxes, the Treasury is committed to increase the proportion of green taxes, which are currently about 8% of the total tax take. But we kind of need to see a bit more ambition than that, because just increasing the proportion of green taxes might just be a few 0.1 percentage points, and we need actually a quite considerable green tax shift. And also the messages coming out of the Treasury are not very consistent. So the 2011 budget was all about putting fuel in the tank of the economy, and initiatives such as the Fair Fuel Stabiliser was really almost a missed opportunity to actually reduce taxes on income rather than reduce taxes on fuel. The green skills gap is also a major barrier to progress. This can really be categorised in three different ways. There's really the core skills that are needed in environmental technologies. These include, for example, 70,000 new engineers in offshore wind that are needed by 2020, and 9,000 graduates needed in the nuclear industry. These take a long time to come on. They're expensive to provide, and there really does need to be some kind of dual funding which is again very challenging in the current fiscal climate. There's also enhanced skills. So these are the skills that are required, for example, for an electrician to fit a solar panel. These jobs are not entirely new in content, but do require some kind of top-up skills and training that have to be done in a very flexible way. And lastly, there's the generic skills. So these are the communication, leadership and management skills that are required in all jobs and all professions, and really does require kind of leadership from the organisation. And lastly, public procurement, because although the government is committed to leverage the £236 billion public procurement power to drive new markets and products and services in this area, this always is quite a low priority in government. There doesn't really seem to be much developing very quickly. And particularly in terms of that kind of driving innovation, public procurement policy is all really about providing minimum standards, but not about forward commitment procurement. So asking about products that don't currently exist and setting the standards. And in terms of inconsistent messages, there's been quite a lot of debate recently about George Osborne's conference speech, and there's really kind of three accusations that I'd like to talk about today. The first is that a decade of environmental laws and regulations are piling costs on the energy bills of households and companies. This seems to be almost now taken for granted, but if you look at the evidence, it's not really true, because it's really oil and gas prices, which have more than doubled in the last 10 years, that have been this major driver to the increase in energy prices. Climate change policies at the moment are only 5% of bills, and also the energy price in the UK is quite competitive. So our gas prices are one of the lowest in Europe, and our electricity prices are kind of in the middle. And of course, the global subsidies for fossil fuels is 5 times greater than the subsidies for renewables. So again, I think more evidence needs to be brought in to this debate on costs. There's also been a lot of debate about influence. So what influence can the UK have on a global problem such as climate change? And the accusation is that in Britain, we make up less than 10% of the world's carbon emissions, to China and Americans 40%. But again, it depends kind of how you look at the UK's influence, because if you calculate our emissions on a consumption basis, so taking into account the goods and services we import from overseas, our record from over the last 15 years has not been very good. We've actually increased emissions by 15% rather than the 19% drop in our production emissions. And we also have a lot of influence in terms of the FTSE. So London currently has, according to Carbon Tracker, over 100 gigatons of carbon reserves listed on the stock exchange. And this is more than 10 times of all the carbon emissions we can emit over the next 40 years. So we obviously have much more influence than that 2% of production emissions that regularly get cites. And as Hune said last week in a speech to the Renewables UK, we might be 2% of the problem, but we should be more than 2% of the solution. And the third message really is about ambition and whether we can go further than other countries and other competitors. And George Osborne did commit to say that the UK should not go any slower, but also no faster than other countries in Europe. And this really does come down to whether we want to be a leader or a laggard in this green economy race, because the UK don't have the huge resources of capital that a country like China does have. And that's why the policy framework is so important. And there's really strong business support from groups like the Aldersgate Group for clear, ambitious and consistent policy. And of course, there does need to be intervention by government. If you look at all the big technological innovations that happened over the last 100 years, including nanotechnology, biotechnology and the internet, they've all required quite significant government funds to get them going. So in light of all this, tonight the Aldersgate Group are hosting a reception in Parliament with Caroline Spellman, and we'll be launching a growth statement. And this will set out 6 recommendations signed by our membership and other businesses and MPs. And it's really putting forward the case for a green economy and the investment and jobs that can come from that. And there are 6 recommendations on carbon legislation, on a green tax shift, on more consistency between economic and environmental policy, on an ambitious green investment bank, reducing those skills gaps that I talked about earlier, and enhancing the role of public procurement and R&D to drive innovation. So is this the greenest government ever, and can the UK win the green economy race? Well, we can definitely do very well, but it will require urgency, it will require delivery, and it will require leadership driven right from the top of government. And I think over the last few weeks we've had in policy, kind of the real buzzword at the moment is consistency. So consistency in messaging, but also consistency in policy. Thank you.